from FBI Director Chris Wray. Welcome. At our second FBI oversight hearing in as many years. When I became chair, I promised to restore the Judiciary Committee's traditional oversight role, including annual oversight hearings for key agencies within our jurisdiction. We've already held the committee's first Department of Justice oversight hearing since 2017, October, and its first Department of Homeland Security oversight hearing since January 2018. There's more to come. Director Wray, when you appeared before the committee last March, just 2 months after the January 6th attack on our Capitol, you told us that domestic terrorism was, quote, metastasizing around the country for a long time now, and it's not going away anytime soon. I first held a hearing on domestic terrorism, the threat to America, in 2012, 10 years ago, after a white supremacist gunman murdered 7 Sikh worshipers in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Today, 10 years later, I'm afraid that threat has only grown worse. In the decades since Oak Creek, violent white supremacists have slaughtered innocent Americans in a series of sickening attacks. They included the mass shootings at the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina in 2015, Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, and a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in 2019. Just this May, a white supremacist marched into a Tops grocery store in Buffalo, New York, massacring 10 Black Americans in cold blood. Last year, Director Wray, you told the committee that the top domestic terror threat was, and I quote, continues to be those we identify as racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocate for the superiority of the white race. You also said that the FBI has elevated racially motivated violent extremism to its top priority, on the same level as ISIS. I look forward to hearing from you about what steps the FBI is taking to protect our communities from this threat. Racist acts of terror like the Buffalo Massacre represent the most persistent, lethal domestic terror threats in our communities, but they are not our only threats by far. So-called militia violent extremists, or MVEs, and other anti-government extremists pose a growing threat to law enforcement and government officials, and as we saw here on January 6th, to our democratic institutions themselves. This is part of the growing trend of politically motivated threats and violence that should alarm every member of this committee. Every one of us should join in condemning the use of violence or threats of violence to advance any political goals, no matter the ideology. But over the past 2 years, our nation's public servants have faced a wave of violence and violent threats. Just yesterday in this room, the committee heard from election officials, Democrats and Republicans, who are receiving death threats because of their work during the 2020 election. We've seen an appalling rise in violent threats against public health workers, school officials, judges, members of Congress, members of the Supreme Court. And we've seen unacceptable, in some cases deadly violence toward law enforcement officers who put their lives on the line to protect us. The dual threats of domestic terrorism and hate crimes are heightened by easy access to firearms in America, especially deadly assault weapons. Matthew Olson, the Justice Department's top counterterrorism official, recently said, the ability of violent extremists to acquire military-grade weapons in this country contributes significantly to their ability to kill and inflict harm on a massive scale. And we cannot ignore the dominant role guns play in assaults and killings of police officers. Our nation is awash in guns. Estimates are 400 million firearms in this nation, from straw purchase handguns to assault weapons that can pierce the Kevlar vest that are supposed to protect our men and women in uniform. Director Wray, I hope you'll discuss how the proliferation of assault weapons impacts the work of the FBI and other law enforcement. We have a lot of ground to cover today. I look forward to your testimony, and with that, I turn to my friend, Ranking Member Grassley, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and welcome to the committee, Director Wray. Thank you for your service to the people of America. This committee has a constitutional obligation to ensure that the FBI complies with the laws that we write and execute those laws according to our intent. In performance of our constitutional duties, we often seek answers and records from the FBI. And if Congress finds potential wrongdoing, we have an obligation to the American people to make that public. The public's business ought to be public. Transparency brings accountability. Just last week, the Justice Department failed yet again to be transparent. The department failed to provide underlying information to support their assumptions that a jury would not convict FBI agents for botching the Nasser investigation. This is beyond unacceptable. I've also asked the FBI about the steps it's taken to investigate Afghan evacuees that are considered significant security concerns. Senator Portman and Inhofe have done exactly the same thing. The FBI won't even tell Congress which field offices are responsible for these security matters. How does that make our communities any safer? Furthermore, based on the killing of al-Qaeda's leader this week, it appears that terrorist groups are still using Afghanistan, as many of us, including you, Director Wray, have feared. The FBI must provide Congress concrete information about the national security and criminal risk of our communities, what they may face with respect to evacuees that weren't vetted properly. As we all see, violence is a very major problem in America today, with rates of violent crime skyrocketing across the country. The start of this violent crime wave began in 2020, as police nationwide were pulled off the streets. Some of the main causes of this rise in violent crime are anti-police rhetoric, depolicing efforts, progressive prosecution, and bail reform. This crisis in policing is happening at the same time the progressive prosecutors refuse to hold violent criminals accountable for their crimes. Witness after witness in this committee has told us that bail reform movement helps to release violent criminals who are arrested so that they can go commit more crimes. Congress must treat violent crime as a top priority. So last week, I introduced a bill entitled Combating Violent and Dangerous Crime Act. The bill contains common sense proposals to reduce the spike in violent crime in the nation, proposals that would expand federal prosecution options for offenses like murder, carjacking, bank robbery, and assault of police officers. The Justice Department and the FBI must also make violent crime a top priority. However, instead of doing so, it seems like the Biden Justice Department, the FBI, have focused on intimidating parents who are concerned about how schools treat their children. For example, it's been reported that the FBI has labeled parents with threat tags to track and investigate them. Contributing to the crime wave, this administration's failure to manage the border has been a drug trafficker's dream. What is the result? Well, in 2021, we had over 100,000 drug overdoses. Fentanyl crossing that border is about 70% of that 100,000. Thanks to our open borders, drug traffickers are poisoning our streets, killing our children, and they're trafficking innocent victims with reckless abandon. This administration is failing the people by not securing the southern border. More recently, my colleagues have heard me on the issue of political bias infecting the FBI decision-making process. As Director Wray is aware, multiple Justice Department whistleblowers have approached my office about that political bias. Whistleblowers are patriots, and they also have to have lots of guts, and most of them do. According to whistleblowers, the FBI opened an investigation on the Trump campaign and its advisors. The opening memo for this Trump investigation is based in a substantial part on liberal news reporting. It's also based on information derived from left-wing nonprofit. Based on allegations, Director Wray and Attorney General Garland reviewed the memo and approved a full investigation. Now, as I've said in my letter, if the FBI is going to open an investigation, you have to do it the right way. It appears that the right way was not done. So, let's contrast this investigation with what the FBI has done with allegedly criminal information received from numerous sources related to Hunter Biden. Simply put, the FBI shut down investigative activity. In August of 2020, the FBI Supervisory Intelligence Analyst opened an assessment. This August 2020 assessment served as a vehicle by which the FBI headquarters team falsely labeled Hunter Biden information as you-know-what disinformation. As just one example, to make my concern clear, in October 2020, an avenue of reporting on Hunter Biden was ordered closed. That Hunter Biden information related to potential criminal activity. According to whistleblowers, the reporting was either verified or verifiable via criminal search warrants. But it was shut down on the basis of it being at risk of disinformation. Based on allegations, the evidence didn't support that finding. So let's look at both of these fact patterns. On the one hand, the FBI greenlit a full investigation into Trump based on liberal news articles and information derived from liberal nonprofits. On the other hand, the FBI closed investigative activities and sources that provided verified or verifiable reporting on Hunter Biden. Director Wray, you'll have to explain to the committee and to the country how you'll manage this mess and how you'll clean house. In conclusion, I'm going to make one last point. In August 2020, and I hope my colleagues will pay attention to this timeline. In August 2020, Senator Johnson and I received an unsolicited and unnecessary briefing from the FBI. Now, this briefing reportedly related to our Biden investigation, but in the end, the briefing had nothing to do with it. The briefing was instituted after the FBI received pressure from my Democrat colleagues to do just that. The content of that briefing were later leaked in order to falsely paint the Grassley-Johnson investigation as advancing you-know-what Russian disinformation. That briefing was held the very same month the FBI opened the assessment that was used to label Hunter Biden's information as you-know-what disinformation. Considering the timing of these events, the timing draws very serious concern. So I'm asking you, Director Wray, simply put, the FBI's credibility is on the line as the principles that help found and sustain our great nation are also on the line. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Director Wray, would you please stand to be sworn? Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that the Director has answered in the affirmative, and you may proceed with your opening statement, sir.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Just a couple of days ago, I passed the 5-year mark for my tenure as director, and I'd like to start today by saying just how proud I am to serve alongside the 38,000 men and women who make up the FBI. Over the past 5 years, I've traveled to all 56 FBI field offices. In fact, as of next week, I will have been to all 56 of them twice. And all over the country, I've spoken with prosecutors, judges, victims, and our law enforcement partners. And I continue to be impressed and moved both by what I see firsthand and by what I hear from others about the quality of our workforce. Our agents, analysts, and professional staff serve the public with rigor, objectivity, and a fierce passion for our mission of protecting the American people and upholding the Constitution. The breadth, depth, and complexity of the threats our folks are tackling are immense, and I continue to be inspired by the work they do on behalf of the American people. Each and every day, the men and women of the FBI are taking on the Chinese government's broad-scale economic espionage campaign, targeting our ideas, our innovation, our economic security. They're working with our government, foreign, and private sector partners to meet the danger from cyber actors, including fighting the scourge of ransomware attacks against U.S. businesses and critical infrastructure. They're battling both domestic and international terrorism, including, as the recent Judicary strike reinforces, the threat of foreign terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda attempting to reconstitute in Afghanistan. They're investigating crimes against children and going after those who would prey on the most vulnerable among us. They're countering hate crimes, including an alarming number of threats aimed at Asian Americans, historically black colleges and universities, religious institutions, and other public spaces across the country. They're ensuring the integrity of elections and working to protect the election workers who administer them, and the list goes on. But I want to use these few minutes to focus on one threat in particular, and Senator Grassley mentioned it as well, which is the threat of violent crime. I speak with chiefs and sheriffs all the time, in fact, just about every week, sometimes more, and the number one concern I hear from them by far is rising violence in their communities, whether it's gangs terrorizing a neighborhood, well-known trigger pullers who keep finding their way back out onto the streets, robbery crews graduating from carjackings to aggravated assaults, and worse. The violent crime problem is real, and it's one we are firmly determined to combat. The core of our violent crime strategy remains our FBI task forces. We are working shoulder to shoulder with our state and local partners all across the country through more than 300 FBI task forces made up of close to 3,000 members. We're using intelligence to drive proactive investigations to identify and target the most violent and dangerous offenders, the worst of the worst. We're working with our partners to build capacity and to provide tools, including by deploying additional resources to some of the hardest hit cities to maximize our impact. And we're seeing results. For instance, in just 1 week this summer, FBI Phoenix arrested more than a dozen individuals on drugs and firearms charges as part of a gang investigation into the Lindo Park Crips. FBI Sacramento, as part of an investigation into the Oak Park Bloods, arrested 8 and seized pounds of methamphetamine, fentanyl, and multiple handguns, including one ghost gun and another equipped with a switch that made it fully automatic. And FBI San Antonio arrested 18 suspected drug traffickers with cartel ties, charging them with trafficking large quantities of methamphetamine. That is just 3 FBI field offices in a single week. If you step back and look at all of last fiscal year, FBI task forces focused on violent crime made more than 17,000 arrests, seized more than 8,000 firearms, and dismantled nearly 300 gangs and criminal enterprises across the country, and we are not going to let up. Now, every chance I get, I also try to highlight that law enforcement is taking on this challenge at a time when the job is becoming more and more dangerous, especially for our state and local brothers and sisters. In 2021, 73 officers were feloniously killed, as in murdered, while on the job, more than in any year since the 9/11 attacks. At the FBI, we experienced our share of loss last year, too. We had Special Agents Laura Schwarzenberger and Dan Alphen killed, taking on one of the hardest jobs we have in the FBI, investigating crimes against children. And one of our longtime task force officers, Terror Detective Greg Ferenczi, was shot and killed in an ambush right outside one of our offices. Alarmingly, this year's deaths are nearly keeping pace with last year's. In fact, this June, more officers were murdered in this country than in any single month in the past 4 years. Now, the men and women of law enforcement make heroic sacrifices for all of us, and they need our support and deserve to know we've got their backs. Now, of course, in addition to the escalation of violent crime, this year has also brought the horror of mass shootings into sharp relief. Places like Buffalo, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, Uvalde, and of course Highland Park in your home state. These attacks on regular, everyday people going about their regular, everyday lives are devastating for the communities affected, certainly, but they touch us all. And I can assure you, the FBI family feels the heartbreak too, and we're committed to doing our part to assist our partners and support victims and their families. At all levels of government and law enforcement, our fundamental duty is to make sure Americans can feel safe and secure in their own communities. And of course, violence and mass violence are just one part of that. The range of criminal and national security threats that we face as a nation has never been greater or more diverse, and the demands and expectations on the FBI have never been higher. Our fellow citizens look to us to protect the United States from all those threats, and I am grateful, as I know we all are, to the men and women of the FBI who continue to rise to meet those challenges every day. So thank you for your support in helping us carry out that mission, and I'd be happy to address your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Director, and let me start close to home, Highland Park, 4th of July, idyllic American holiday, families watching a parade in a wonderful town that I'm honored to represent. In comes a shooter with an AR-15, perches himself on a roof, fires away. We think 83 rounds were delivered in a matter of a minute or less. The net result, of course, is not only 7 dead and scores wounded, but wounds that will be there for a long time. Yesterday, a little 9-year-old boy named Cooper Roberts, who was shot by this gunman with one of these assault rifles, was released from the hospital. This poor little boy, absent a miracle, is going to be paralyzed for life. You've mentioned that this isn't the only instance where assault rifles are being turned on people in innocent situations. I could go through the same list you have and add even more. I won't do that. But I'm also noticing more and more that our law enforcement officials themselves are more vulnerable because of these assault rifles. Bullets fired from an AR-15 are powerful enough to pierce soft body armor, the form most commonly used by police. Bullets fired by Sig Sauer MCX Spear have an even greater range than the traditional AR-15 and can pierce nearly all kinds of body armor, including those stronger than what is typically worn by law enforcement. The bottom line is this proliferation of guns, particularly assault weapons, is deadly and dangerous when it comes to our law enforcement. What is your observation?
Well, Mr. Chairman, there are an awful lot of really dangerous people out there, and in some days, I will say to those of us in law enforcement, it seems like there are more and more of them, and those people are only more dangerous with more dangerous weapons. And certainly, I know just this week, we had a couple of our agents who were shot at with, I believe, an assault rifle that multiple rounds penetrating the vehicle they were in. Thankfully, they were not injured, but I worry every day about that. And I know that my counterparts, my fellow law enforcement leaders, chiefs and sheriffs, worry about it all the time as well. We are all trying to do the best we can with better and better protective equipment, better and better training, better and better munitions of our own. But certainly it is a dangerous world out there, and the statistics that I cited in my opening statement are illustrative of what a dangerous job it is out there for law enforcement. And one of the points that I didn't make in my opening statement, that is of that 73 that were murdered on the line of duty, in the line of duty last year, an alarming percentage of those were killed in effect in types of ambush situations, not unlike our task force officer in Indiana who was ambushed. I think he was out on a lunch break outside our office. So I worry about our folks every day, and I will tell you that the hardest thing I've ever had to do, certainly in this job, is sit and talk with the families of our fallen.
One of the most outrageous examples of violence against law enforcement occurred right here in the U.S. Capitol complex on January 6, 2021, when an insurrectionist mob attacked the men and women who were trying to defend me and us in this building. The net result of it, at least 5 people died and over 140 law enforcement were injured. It has resulted in, I think, the largest prosecution in Department of Justice history. The numbers now are 850 suspects have been arrested. But the FBI is still trying to identify more than 350 suspects believed to have committed violent acts on the Capitol grounds. That is the same number of unidentified suspects that were reported 10 months, 1 year, and 14 months after the event. What has made it so difficult to identify these 350 additional suspects?
Well, I think in some instances, a lot of the initial people that we were able to find and arrest and charge made themselves widely visible and easily identifiable on social media or otherwise. But there were a certain number of people who concealed themselves more effectively. And so part of it is a little more challenging to get those people identified. That's part of it. And then, of course, as I have to be a little bit careful what I say here, but we are continuing to develop some of the more complicated parts of the investigation in terms of conspiracy charges and that sort of thing. So that may also contribute to some of it.
One of the other elements was whether or not the FBI and others should have been forewarned of what was going to occur on January 6th. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I would say 2 things. One, we and DHS were both throughout 2020 putting out intelligence products warning about the prospect of different forms of politically motivated violence, including related to the election, including even after the election, potentially related to January 6th. But it is also the reality that we did not have, I think, any specific credible intelligence that pointed to thousands of people breaching the Capitol. And so one of the things that we are determined to do on our part, to make sure we can do our part to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again, is to see how we can go about developing better sources. Anytime in the intelligence field, when there is any kind of successful attack, we make a point of trying to figure out, are there better ways to develop sources, higher quality sources, et cetera. So we're doing that now.
If I can ask you a question on that. Given the extensive online planning for the violence on January 6th, I was surprised to hear Jill Sanborn, the FBI's former counterterrorism head, say last year that it is not within the FBI's authorities to monitor publicly available social media conversations. How do you reconcile this with the Attorney General's guidelines, which authorize the FBI to, quote, proactively surf the internet to find publicly available websites where the promotion of terrorist crimes are openly taking place?
Well, as you reference, what we can and cannot do is largely covered in the Attorney General guidelines, and I think to some extent also in what we call the DIOG. And it's a more complicated topic in terms of what we can and cannot do than I can get into in the time remaining. But what I would say, and I think what former EAD Sanborn was trying to say, is that we don't have authority to persistently and and passively just sit on the internet monitoring social media. It's more complicated than that, but with proper predication and an authorized purpose, there are things we can do in terms of publicly available social media. But it's a longer, more involved topic than I could really do justice to here.
Well, I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but it seems to me that the use of artificial intelligence by other agencies has made this a more efficient operation. Is that being considered by the FBI?
Absolutely. You're spot on that artificial intelligence is, just as it is in the private sector and other fields, artificial intelligence is an incredibly important tool. The FBI, just like other organizations, has a big data problem, and artificial intelligence is an important tool as we go forward to being better at getting through the mountains of information that's out there in a more efficient and effective way.
Thank you. Senator Grassley?
Yeah, on our June 16th phone call, we discussed the need to protect whistleblowers that have approached my office from retaliation. Thank you for committing to protecting them. You told me that you would see eye to eye with me on the importance of whistleblowers. I appreciate your commitment. Two very short related questions. Do you agree that any retaliatory conduct against whistleblowers must be disciplined?
I think retaliatory conduct against whistleblowers is unacceptable. They serve a very, very important role in our system. I know you have long championed the cause of whistleblowers, and we have a number of mechanisms to try to make sure that they have the mechanisms to report, but also the mechanisms to be protected from retaliation. One of the things that I've been doing since I became director is that every time we bring all of our SACs, our special agents in charge across the country together, which we do twice a year, we have the Inspector General, Mr. Horowitz, come and talk to all of them, in particular to talk to them about the importance of whistleblowers and making sure that whistleblowers are protected.
Let me take one step before that would happen if they were going to be disciplined or not. Can you commit that to me and this committee and the Senate that the FBI won't take any action to determine who the whistleblowers are in the first place?
We will be scrupulous in our adherence to the rules related to whistleblowers. Obviously, if there are allegations of misconduct by FBI employees, we want to make sure that we get that information so that we can use the tools that we have to go after that conduct. But certainly, I condemn in the strongest possible terms any prospect of retaliation against whistleblowers.
I would like to know if the FBI received information. Now, I'm not asking about a case here. I'm just about information that foreign persons had received. Let me start over again. If the FBI received information that foreign persons had evidence of improper or unlawful financial payments paid to elected officials or other politically exposed persons, would that pose a national security concern?
Well, I think the kind of conduct you're describing is typically something that we would look at very closely through our efforts at malign foreign influence. It starts to shade into a blend of what we call malign foreign influence with potentially public corruption, and it's something that we take seriously.
Thank you. Another question following up kind of on that point of view. Pursuant to FBI policies and protocols, what steps should the FBI take to vet or more fully investigate evidence of improper or unlawful financial payment paid to elected officials and other politically exposed persons?
Well, I think at the risk of sounding like a lawyer, like I used to be, it depends on the facts and circumstances of each case. But we would certainly need to look into that, and depending on the circumstances, there could be an assessment, there could be an investigation, there could be any number of steps that would be taken to make sure that there's not a national security risk.
It kind of follows up on what you just said. Does the FBI have a criteria that it uses to evaluate whether information is or isn't disinformation? If so, what is that criteria?
So when it comes to disinformation, we don't look at I think sometimes this gets lost in a lot of the public commentary. We're not out there investigating whether or not information that we see floating around is truthful or false in the first instance. Our focus in the malign foreign influence space, which is I think what you're driving at, is on whether or not there's a foreign adversary of some sort potentially trying to push the information, and then from there, we look into it. When it comes to disinformation and, say, defensive briefings, for example, there is an interagency process that was set up under the last administration that's OD&I coordinated, because an awful lot of the information that speaks to whether something might be disinformation is coming not from the FBI, but from other intelligence agencies, or in some cases from foreign allies. And so there's a process to make sure that we are approaching that information consistently and objectively. And of course, the defensive briefings that we do, whether it's for members of Congress, officials in the administration, businesses, universities, what have you, the whole point of the defensive briefing is to share information with the recipient to educate them so that they can make decisions about what they want to do. But again, that's not an FBI coordinated process, an interagency framework led by OD&I on that.
When the FBI receives potential criminal investigation relating to a matter that is subject to investigation and prosecution by a U.S. attorney, is it the FBI's standard practice to share that information with the relevant U.S. attorneys' offices?
My expectation is that when a particular office has the lead, both the U.S. Attorney's Office and the relevant FBI field office, that if other offices come across that information that's relevant to that, we want to make sure those tips and leads are passed to the responsible office.
Okay. The FBI has a FBI Director Special Agent Advisory Committee that presents reports and concerns to you. The committee consists of FBI agents from all of its field offices. It has been alleged to me that FBI agents provided information outlining concerns that the FBI has become too politicized in its decision-making. It's been alleged that those concerns were removed from this year's final report. Wouldn't you agree that field agents' concern of that level of significance should be included in the report? What steps will you take to address the concerns raised by these FBI agents?
Well, I have conversations on this topic with agents both on the advisory committees and even outside the committees all the time. Like, so when I go out to field offices, for example, one of the things that I do, and especially in this second round of field office visits, is that I said I want to cut away all the layers between me and the frontline supervisors down at the coalface in the field offices. So in every one of these field offices on this second round of visits, I said no management, just me and them, 45 minutes or so. I want to be able to hear it directly without all the bubble wrap that exists around the FBI director. And I found that to be a very productive way to try to make sure I'm getting closer to, to the action and to the great people we have out on the front lines.
I think you've answered the process, but you haven't answered the specific thing about why that information was taken out of the report.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the
Can you
specific...
follow up and get back to me?
Let me see if there's something we can share with you on that.
Thank
you. Senator Feinstein.
Chairman, after the release, Director Wray, of the IG report on the mishandling of the Larry Nassar investigation, the FBI publicly promised to, quote, take all necessary steps to ensure that the failures of the employees outlined in the report do not happen again. Our offices have discussed at great length what steps the FBI has taken to ensure that these failures are never repeated. One of the improvements, as I understand it, includes making sure in cases of suspected child sexual abuse, the FBI uses child and adolescent forensic interviewers. These individuals are specially trained to conduct interviews of minors who may have experienced sexual abuse. Please outline for us other improvements the FBI has made in how it handles investigations in child sexual abuse cases. I'm very concerned with this, particularly with regard to how the FBI engages with survivors of child sexual abuse and what more needs to be done.
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. Let me just say at the outset, as this committee heard me say when I appeared before you on the NASA report, words escape me to describe to you how upset I was
Yes,
when I
that's
learned what our folks had failed to do back in 2015. And we've taken a number of steps. You mentioned one of them, the increased use of CAFIs, as we call them, child adolescent forensic interviewers. But a few of the others that I would mention is that we've made all sorts of changes to strengthen our policies and procedures that add double and triple checks even to make sure that all FBI employees are handling these reports with the urgency that's required and communicating with the right people, both state and local law enforcement and within the FBI. So that's one piece of it, and there's a bunch of subparts of that. Training. We've put in place a whole bunch of new training, mandatory training for everybody in the FBI, no matter what their responsibilities are. I've taken the training myself to make sure that we learn the lessons from that horrific chapter. But then we've added on top of that very tailored, specific training, again, learning the lessons from the NASA IG report that go to the people who handle these types of cases. So those are a few of the things we've done. We have tried to message it over and over again. I will tell you that we have adopted every single one of Inspector General Horowitz's recommendations, implemented them all, and have gone above and beyond.
Thank you. I am concerned about the rise in gun purchases, especially since the FBI is required to abandon any background check that is not completed in 88 days. This is, as I see it, a loophole that's dangerous and would be addressed by a bill I've introduced called the NICS Data Integrity Act. What has the FBI done to ensure the background check system remains effective during this spike in sales of guns? And do you need additional resources or authorities to make sure background checks are completed effectively and efficiently?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. It's certainly, you are absolutely right that we've had a significant increase in volume of NICS checks that we've, I think in 2020, I think it was, we had a record year of number. And of course, with some of the recent legislation that's been passed, I would expect we'll have even more. We have surged resources to try to keep up with the volume and the demand, but we will need more. Congress has already been helpful in giving us some additional resources, but my expectation is that we will continue to need more resources, not just personnel resources, but systems, IT resources, because the whole essence of the NICS system is taxing in terms of system upgrades and so forth, and the interconnectivity and the accessibility for our state and local partners and so forth. So, so we will need more resources. I'm not in a position to comment on specific pending legislation, of course, but I'm confident in telling you that we will continue to need resources for personnel and IT upgrades.
I wonder, since over the 300,000 potential firearm sales were blocked in 2020, I congratulate you for this. Can you give us some reference to the kinds of things that were blocked?
Well, the transactions that are blocked are transactions where somebody who's a prohibited person is trying to purchase a weapon. Obviously, the biggest chunk of those are people who are convicted felons. And you might be surprised, but it's sometimes remarkable how many convicted felons still walk into a gun store and try to buy a gun. Of course, there are, under Section 922, a number of other prohibitors as well. Domestic violence, mental illness. Again, I'm using layman terms. The language is more specific in the statute. But the full range of prohibitors are involved in the denials that we have made.
Thank you. I want to just point out that since I'm from the West, since the beginning of the pandemic, the Asian American and Pacific Islander community has seen a deeply disturbing increase in hate crime incidents. Last year in my hometown of San Francisco, city officials reported a 567% rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. San Francisco police received reports of 8 incidents of hate crimes against this community in 2019 and 9 reports in 2020. In 21, there were 60. So it's up. We believe that this is not unique to California, and I am concerned with it. How is the FBI working with state and local officials to help combat the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islander communities?
So we elevated civil rights, which hate crimes is the biggest chunk of our civil rights program, to a national threat priority in the last fiscal year, and will be again this fiscal year. I think in calendar year 21, we had the highest number of hate crime initiations that we've had in maybe 5 years or so. We are also, so there's a lot of investigative work going on. In addition, though, we're doing a lot of outreach to the community. I think in 21, we had something like 140 different training or liaison events with the AAPI community around the country. And we've had listening sessions on the national level. We're also trying to provide forensic support, even in cases where there's not going to be a federal prosecution. It doesn't mean that we have nothing to do with it. We try to help in terms of forensic support and other expertise and experience. So we obviously are concerned about a lot of the same things that you are.
Thank you for that. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Feinstein. Our friend and colleague, Senator Cornyn, is recovering from COVID. We wish him well, and he's going to join us virtually now in questioning the director. Senator Cornyn, are you with us?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you. Yes, Senator.
Good morning, Director Wray. Senator Grassley talked about the unprecedented amount of illegal drugs that are coming across the border that contributed to the overdose deaths of 108,000 Americans last year alone. I want to ask you, you alluded to the FBI task forces that deal with crime in communities all across the country. Are criminal street gangs the primary distribution network for those illegal drugs that come across the border?
That's certainly, I think anecdotally, I don't know that I have the intelligence assessment in front of me, but I think we would say that criminal street gangs are the vehicle that we interact with the most as distribution mechanisms for drugs that are coming from the cartels and transnational criminal organizations south of the border.
And these criminal street gangs, I think you alluded to this, are responsible for a significant portion of the violence, including gun violence in communities across our country as they battle for market share and territory, correct?
Absolutely right. When I'm out talking with chiefs and sheriffs, and talking to them just about every week, I find more and more that that's what we're seeing. There certainly are national gangs that we're concerned about, but I think Americans might be surprised to hear how many essentially neighborhood gangs, to use the terminology that a lot of chiefs and sheriffs would use, are, in many ways, the biggest driver of violence in a lot of our communities.
And of course, they deal in all sorts of illicit activities, but the profits from the distribution of these drugs a significant portion of how they make money?
Yes, very much so.
Okay. And when you talk about the rise in violent crime being one of your most urgent concerns, I think the country certainly would agree with you. The statistics tell the tale of the significant spike in crime, and of course, along with it, the public concern for that. Would you attribute some of the violence, increased violence that you're seeing to these gangs, to their drug business? I'm trying to figure out if you will agree with me that there is a nexus between drugs, gangs, and guns. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the first things I'm asking about in all these field office visits, both to our own people and to our law enforcement partners, when we sit privately and have listening sessions where I'm really asking them questions, that's what you just said is something I hear about over and over and over again.
Well, I know there's been a lot more attention focused on the border in terms of the flow of migrants across the 3 million encounters the Border Patrol has had. But one of the tactics it looks like that the cartels are using is to overwhelm the Border Patrol and other U.S. law enforcement agencies so they can then move the drugs across the border. We know how many people were encountered, roughly 3 million, but the Border Patrol estimates that there could be as many as 300,000 so-called getaways. These are people who obviously weren't seeking asylum and weren't turning themselves in to engage in that process. When Director Mayorkas was asked about the border, he made the, frankly, from my standpoint, implausible statement that the border was secure. From your vantage point, in your opinion, is the border secure?
Well, boy, I guess I'm hesitant to substitute my judgment for the Secretary of Homeland Security, but I will tell you that I have spent a lot of time with our field offices down that have border responsibility. I have been to ports of entry, including not that long ago with CBP officers walking me through it so I could really see firsthand what they're up against. And all I can say is, boy, they got a heck of a challenge, and I admire their grit and their determination to get the job done because it's a daunting one.
Director Wray, I've always thought of you as a straight shooter, but you won't answer that question.
Well, look, I think the border presents significant security issues. There's a wide array of criminal threats that we encounter down at the border. You mentioned a little bit in some of your questions the transnational criminal organizations that use diverse and complex methods to traffic drugs. That then cascades over into prison and street gangs who distribute it. We are trying to tackle it on our end in support of our partners, both DHS but also state and local partners, not just on our side of the border through the task forces that I mentioned, but also on the other side of the border. We have I think our biggest LEGAD office is in Mexico City. We have transnational anti-gang task forces that we work with our local partners in the Northern Triangle. But it is a major challenge, and it represents significant concerns for us.
In my most recent trip to the border, Senator Cruz and I took a number of our Republican conference down to the border, many of whom had made that trip before. But we continue to hear the same sort of message from the Border Patrol in terms of the nationalities of the people they encounter there. And my recollection is in one sector, the Del Rio sector, they reported encounters from people from 150 plus countries. In other words, it's not just a south of the border issue in terms of Mexico, Central America, and the like. This is an international human smuggling network. Would you agree with me?
I don't have the numbers like it sounds like you do, but I certainly know that it is an eclectic mix of nationalities, and the volume is just staggering.
And that's a public security threat. You agree with me?
To me, it represents a significant security issue and represents a wide array of criminal threats that flow out of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Get well. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray. As you know, we are now entering the fourth year of a frustrating saga that began with an August 2019 letter from me and Senator Coons regarding the Kavanaugh supplemental background investigation, and I'd like to try to get that matter wrapped up. First, is it true that after Kavanaugh-related tips were separated from regular tip line traffic, they were forwarded to White House counsel without investigation?
I apologize that in advance that it's been frustrating for you. We've tried to be clear about
Okay,
our process.
I'll be less frustrated if you just answer the question.